This is the image haunting the White House this morning. The kind of image no amount of spin, no rally, and no flood of posts can bury, because it isn't a talking point. It's a reality you can see with your own eyes. Pull up the live security feeds from JFK in New York, LAX in Los Angeles, and O'Hare in Chicago, and you'll witness something that feels impossible in a modern economy. A Friday morning in late January, the exact window when these terminals usually pulse with tourists, business travelers, cargo crews, and the quiet machinery of global commerce. And yet today, they look like abandoned sets after the cameras stop rolling, silent hallways, empty queues, lights on with no audience, as if the country has been temporarily removed from the map. At 6 a.m. Eastern, a decentralized grassroots movement that started as a meme in Europe and then caught fire across Asian markets didn't just trend online. It landed in the real world with frightening speed, morphing from a political sentiment into a consumer-driven economic weapon that doesn't need legislation, negotiations, or treaties to activate. They're calling it the Great American Boycott. And unlike formal sanctions that take months to draft and years to bite, this hit like a switch flipped in the dark. Travel bookings to the United States collapsed in a single day. Ports began slowing American cargo through procedural delays that look harmless on paper but suffocate in practice. And across social platforms in Asia, consumers made a spectacle of rejecting U.S. brands in viral displays that spread faster than any press secretary can respond. Inside Washington, the panic isn't subtle because this crisis targets the one thing the administration understands instinctively: the brand. The president knows that power is not only policy, it's perception. And perception is where the damage is concentrated. For decades, the United States exported a kind of cultural gravity, an aura that made people want to visit, buy, invest, imitate, align, and even forgive. That aura is the real asset, more valuable than any single company, any single trade deal, any single speech. And the nightmare scenario now is that the aura has inverted, that the U.S. brand has shifted from aspiration to aversion, not because a government declared it, but because millions of individuals decided it in the same moment without permission, without leadership, without a central office to pressure. That's the part Washington can't solve with threats, because you can coerce a state into signing a treaty, but you cannot force a customer to walk into a store. You cannot subpoena a mood. You cannot sue a zeitgeist. This isn't a policy blockade imposed by parliaments. It's a refusal made by people, and that makes it immune to the normal tools of retaliation. The WTO cannot compel a teenager in Paris to buy American shoes, and it can't compel a dock worker in Rotterdam to move faster if the slowdown is framed as safety and inspection. The legal system can't prosecute millions of micro-decisions happening every minute across thousands of cities because the mechanism isn't violence, it's choice. And choice is the quietest form of power. What makes this boycott uniquely dangerous isn't only what consumers do on the street, it's how labor and logistics can amplify it without ever calling it a strike. Global transport networks don't need to stop. They only need to slow. And slow is catastrophic in a world built on just-in-time delivery. One extra day becomes three becomes a week becomes empty shelves and stalled factories. Retail chains begin warning of shortages, manufacturers start missing parts, exporters watch goods rot on docks, and suddenly the consequences of foreign policy aren't abstract debates on television. They're personal, they're in the pharmacy line, they're in the repair shop, they're in the grocery aisle, and that's when apolitical people turn political, not out of ideology, but out of anger that their normal life got interrupted. At the same time, something even colder is happening far from the crowds. Boardrooms are quietly moving money. The world's largest corporations don't need to announce their decisions with dramatic press conferences. They just shift investment timelines, relocate research teams, rebalance inventory, and reduce exposure in ways that never trend but always bleed. This isn't a market crash that happens in one loud day. It's a capital suffocation that unfolds like a slow tightening. Markets can tolerate controversy. They cannot tolerate instability. And when leadership turns a country into an unpredictability risk, shareholders don't moralize. They exit because that's what capital does when it senses a conflict zone forming inside what used to be a safe harbor. And then there's the silence, the psychological detail that matters more than most people realize. When world leaders stop answering calls, when statements are met with polite non-engagement, when diplomacy becomes a closed door and a calendar that's always unavailable, that's not weakness, it's strategy. There is nothing more destabilizing to a leader who feeds on reaction than being treated as irrelevant, because outrage is still attention, argument is still engagement, even condemnation is still proof you matter. But being ignored is different. Being ghosted is an international message that says, you are no longer the center of the room. And that message doesn't just bruise ego, it signals to markets and institutions that the power structure has shifted. As this spreads, tech becomes the next fault line, because modern influence is not only diplomacy or trade, it's infrastructure, data, platforms, payment networks, and the digital pipelines that keep economies breathing. Regulatory threats abroad can instantly remove revenue streams, fracture access to consumers, and force CEOs into emergency rooms of negotiation where loyalty is irrelevant and survival is the only language. In that environment, the question isn't whether corporations support the administration. It's whether they can afford to be associated with it. And association risk is the most contagious risk of all, because it converts a political problem into a corporate hazard. Back home, the fear compounds in real time, because once the public senses a supply chain strain, the instinct is predictable: panic buying, hoarding, rushing for essentials, and every shelf emptied becomes proof that the system is wobbling, which creates the very shortage people feared. And once shortages appear, blame becomes a weapon. People don't debate macroeconomics when they can't get what they need. They blame whoever is in charge. That's how a foreign policy crisis becomes a domestic legitimacy crisis overnight. And legitimacy is the real currency that holds institutions together. Above all of this, a larger threat hangs in the background like a storm cloud that turns a crisis into an existential question. What happens when global confidence in the U.S. system itself weakens? Reserve status, investment inflows, the ability to borrow cheaply, the assumption that U.S. assets are the default safe place. None of that is guaranteed by force. It's guaranteed by trust. When trust erodes, alternatives stop being theoretical and start becoming meetings, votes, coordinated hedges, and contingency plans. And the frightening truth is that you don't need the entire world to pivot away for the shock to hit. You only need enough of the world to doubt, enough to diversify, enough to test the exit, because financial systems react to direction as much as destination. This week changed the logic of power. It started with politics, escalated into psychology, and matured into economics, driven not by governments, but by people, unions, algorithms, investors, and the collective decision to disengage. The lesson is harsh but simple. You can rule by fear for a while, but eventually fear stops working. And when it stops working, people don't just resist, they reorganize. This boycott isn't an army you can arrest, a leader you can negotiate with, or a treaty you can rewrite. It is millions of closed wallets and turned backs. And when the world turns its back, a nation doesn't just lose sales, it loses gravity. Now the market's open again, and Monday doesn't care about excuses. If confidence continues to slip, the damage won't be measured only in headlines or approval ratings. It will be measured in capital flows, jobs, shortages, investment decisions, and the irreversible shift in how the United States is perceived. Stay alert, stay grounded, and understand the core reality Washington is learning too late. You can demand loyalty from institutions, but you cannot command desire. And when desire disappears, the brand collapses. And when the brand collapses, the economy follows.